The quality of light that penetrated the north transept of Ravenswood Abbey was, Miss Lucinda Hargreave had always maintained, specifically calibrated for piety. It was a thin, dusty, forgiving sort of light, adept at glossing over the more egregious Victorian repairs and lending an air of profound antiquity to stone that was, in places, barely older than the municipal gasworks. Today, however, that holy gloom was being violated. It was being sliced apart by the intrusive flash of a press photographer's bulb, a device that Councillor Alistair Finch appeared to have brought along as part of his own personal retinue. A little to the left, if you would, Councillor. The man from the Flaxborough Chronicle crouched, his posture that of a man preparing to photograph a badger at its set. Let's get the angel properly in the frame. Lovely, Councillor Finch obliged. He was a man whose physique seemed moulded by public service, a solid, dependable frontage, tapering to surprisingly narrow ankles, giving him the look of an inverted pyramid of reliability. He placed a proprietary hand on the edge of the new, custom-built display case. Inside, cushioned on a bed of alarmingly crimson velvet, sat the gilded angel of St. Odo. It was, to be charitable, a modest seraph. No bigger than a milk bottle, it was a carving of indeterminate wood, covered in a layer of gold leaf that had been sensitively restored, a process which had left it looking less like a 14th century devotional object and more like a trophy for a regional baking competition. This Councillor Finch announced to the assembled audience of three, Miss Hargreave, the photographer, and a very bored-looking Sergeant Love, who had been roped in for security, is a proud day for Flaxborough, a day when we reclaim our heritage not as a dusty relic, but as a beacon for the future. Miss Hargreave winced. To speak of the Abbey's treasures in such a forward-looking manner felt deeply improper, like discussing turbine engines at a funeral. She clutched her handbag, a formidable leather construction that contained, amongst other things, the sole key to the transept's ancient oak door. The council's investment in this state-of-the-art, pressurized, security-bolted case, Finch continued, tapping the thick glass with a manicured finger, ensures that the gilded angel will be safe for generations of visitors to admire. Miss Hargreave shot a venomous look at the fingerprint he had just left on the glass. She had personally polished it not 10 minutes ago. It was, she reflected, typical of the council. All grand pronouncements and greasy fingers. They had insisted on this vulgar glass box with its ugly steel clasps when a simple niche in the wall, tastefully barred, of course, would have been infinitely more appropriate. Sergeant Love shifted his weight from one foot to the other. His presence was, he felt, entirely superfluous. The greatest threat to public order in Ravenswood Abbey was the annual church fete, and even then, the trouble was usually confined to a mild disagreement over the pricing of the marmalade. He caught Inspector Purbright's eye as his superior entered the transept, moving with the quiet, unhurried tread of a man who was never surprised by anything. All seems to be in order. Inspector, Sergeant Love offered, a note of hope in his voice. So it would seem. Sergeant, Pubright murmured, his gaze taking in the scene. He looked at the gleaming angel, the proud councillor, and the thunderous expression on Miss Hargreave's face. It was a tableau of small-town life as neatly composed as a watercolour. A fine piece of work. It was unclear whether he meant the angel, the security case, or the councillor's performance. The flashbulb popped one last time, capturing Finch in a moment of beaming civic pride. The business of the day being concluded, the photographer packed his bag. Councillor Finch gave the case a final paternal pat before making his excuses. It was nearly lunchtime at the golf club, and the business of heritage had made him thirsty. Left alone with Pubright and Love, Miss Hargreave seemed to relax, her shoulders losing some of their ramrod stiffness. She approached the display case not as a public monument but as a ward. "It is rather bright, isn't it?" she said to Pubright, her tone confessional. The restorers were perhaps a little over-enthusiastic with the gilding. "It certainly catches the light," the inspector replied. Politely, indeed, She produced a chamois leather from her handbag and briskly buffed away Councillor Finch's offending fingerprint. "Now, if you'll excuse me, Inspector, it's time for the angel to have its rest." With the policeman watching, she began her nightly ritual. A heavy iron grille was pulled across the transept archway and secured with a padlock the size of a man's fist. Then she moved to the towering oak door. She inserted the enormous iron key, turned it once, then twice. The lock shot its bolts with a series of satisfying, definitive clunks that echoed in the stone silence. She jiggled the handle to be quite sure. It was immovable. "There," she said, a note of triumph in her voice.
"Safe as houses. Safer, in fact."
"No one is getting in there until I unlock it for matins tomorrow." Inspector Pubright nodded, his expression unreadable.
"I have no doubt of that, Miss Hargreave."
No doubt at all. He and Love walked out into the pale afternoon sun, leaving the Abbey to its ancient peace, its single gilded treasure locked securely away from the world. A bastion of civic pride and local history, sealed in glass and stone, utterly and completely safe. The rituals of the morning were as sacred to Miss Hargreave as the liturgy itself. At precisely 7:30, she let herself into the Abbey grounds, the air tasting of damp stone and the promise of another uneventful day. The great iron key, cool and heavy in her hand, felt like an extension of her own will. She performed the unlocking of the transept door with the same methodical care as she had the locking. The bolts slid back with their familiar reassuring groans. The door swung inward, admitting a slice of the grey morning. For a moment, all was as it should be. The light, still weak, was resuming its pious duties in the north transept. The air was still and cold. Miss Hargreave's gaze went, as it always did, directly to the glass case, a small act of maternal reassurance. And then she stopped. It was not a sudden shock, but a slow, creeping horror, a dawning realization that the universe had tilted dangerously on its axis. The crimson velvet was empty. The hollow where the gilded angel of St. Odo had rested for less than a day was now a small, perfect depression, a wound in the fabric. The angel was gone.
Utterly, completely, and impossibly gone. Miss Hargreave's hand flew to her throat, but she did not scream. A scream would have been a vulgar admission of chaos.
Instead, a small, dry sound like the snapping of a twig escaped her lips. Her eyes, sharp and unforgiving, scanned the case. The glass was unbroken, the steel clasps undisturbed. It was as if the angel had simply evaporated, but it had not. For there, resting precisely in the centre of the velvet hollow, was a single feather. It was long and slender, a shimmering, hypnotic slash of emerald and sapphire capped with a perfect, iridescent eye. A peacock feather. The sheer, lunatic incongruity of it was what finally broke her composure. This was not a theft. This was an insult, a piece of flamboyant, theatrical mockery left in the heart of her sanctuary. Her first human contact was with Beatrice Plummet, the Abbey's caretaker, who arrived 5 minutes later with a bucket and a profound sense of grievance about the state of the vestry floor. She found Miss Hargreave standing stiffly before the empty case, radiating an aura of silent, incandescent rage. "Morning, Miss Harg."
"Oh, my lord above," Beatrice breathed, her eyes widening.
She dropped her bucket with a clang that seemed to desecrate the silence.
"It's gone."
"The little gold fellow?"
"He's gone." "Do not state the obvious, Beatrice," Miss Hargreave snapped, her voice brittle. Beatrice, however, was not looking at the empty space.
She was staring mesmerized at the feather. She crossed herself, a gesture more reflexive than devout.
"Is the ghost, miss?"
"The grey monk. They say he walks the transept when his rest is disturbed."
"And that newfangled case? All that banging and drilling?"
"We've disturbed him." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that travelled with surprising efficiency.
And the peacock feather.
That's a sign of a watchful spirit. My grandmother always said so.
An omen. By the time Inspector Pubright and Sergeant Love arrived an hour later, the omen had already done its work.
The news, transmitted via Beatrice's early morning chat with the milkman, had metastasized into civic myth. Councillor Finch was on the scene, his face the colour of putty, his dependable frontage looking distinctly unstable. He was alternating between assuring Miss Hargreave that the police would handle everything and trying to catch the inspector's eye with a look that pleaded for a swift, tidy and, above all, quiet resolution. Pubright surveyed the small gathering. It was less a crime scene and more a fraught tea party where the guest of honour had inexplicably vanished. Miss Hargreave was issuing a clipped, precise, and entirely unhelpful account of her locking-up procedure. Councillor Finch was talking about insurance valuations and the potential damage to the town's tourism prospectus. And Beatrice Plummet, who had been asked to wait by the door, was quietly explaining her grey monk theory to a very attentive young constable. "No signs of forced entry, sir," Sergeant Love reported, having made a thorough circuit of the transept. "Doors solid, windows are 100 years of grime, and led away from being opened. The grille is just as Miss Hargreave left it." "And the case itself?" Pubright asked, his gaze resting on the peacock feather. It looked utterly alien against the municipal crimson, a small, beautiful piece of chaos, locked up tight. "Not a scratch on it," Love confirmed. He lowered his voice.
"It's as if someone just
waved a hand and lifted it out. Or maybe it was a ghost with a feather. He attempted a small, professional smile. Pubright did not return it. He looked from the feather to the frantic face of the counsellor, and then to the rigid, offended posture of Miss Hargreave. He was not investigating the simple theft of a gilded artifact. He was investigating an attack on civic pride and a violation of sacred routine. And in a town like Flaxborough, he knew, those were far more serious crimes. Inspector Pubright suggested they retire to the vestry. It was a small, cold room smelling of hymn books and decaying cassocks, but it had the distinct advantage of being free from both spectral theories and civic panic. He invited Miss Hargreave to sit, which she did on the very edge of a hard wooden chair, as if suspecting it of modernist tendencies. "Now, Miss Hargreave," Pubright began, his tone gentle, "you mentioned you have the only key to the transept door." "The only key," she affirmed, her voice a bastion of certainty. "It was forged in 1788 by a Mr. Albright of whom my great-grandfather spoke very highly. It has never been copied. There is no need for a copy." The unspoken addendum was that the very concept of a copy was an affront to the key's unique and venerable existence. "And this key," Pubright continued, "it remained in your possession overnight?" "Of course." She patted the formidable leather handbag which now sat on her lap, like a loyal guard dog. "It never leaves my bag, and my bag never leaves my side. It was on the hook by my bed, as it always is. I am a creature of habit, Inspector." "It is the only way to ensure order, I see." Pubright made a small note. Sergeant Love, standing by the door, dutifully copied it down, though what he wrote was anyone's guess. "And the display case itself? You saw Councillor Finch lock it after the ceremony?" A flicker of contempt crossed Miss Hargreave's face. Councillor Finch did not lock it. The fitters from the security firm did. They demonstrated its patented multi-lever mechanism. A great deal of fuss and a very small, flimsy-looking key, which they then handed to the councillor, who handed it to me. He made a great show of it for the photographer. "So you have that key as well?" "I do." She opened her bag and, after a moment of rummaging, produced a small, shiny silver key. It looked insignificant, a toy, next to the image of the great iron one she guarded so fiercely. "I locked the case myself before I left, and I can assure you it was perfectly secure, although I have never trusted these modern locks. Too clever by half. They invite cleverness in others. The old ways are best."
A simple, honest bolt. Everyone knows where they stand with a bolt. Pubright took the small key, examined its unremarkable teeth, and handed it back. "Thank you, Miss Hargreave."
"You've been most clear." His interview with Councillor Finch took place in the same chair, though Finch occupied it differently, leaning back with an air of beleaguered authority. "A terrible business, Inspector." "Simply terrible," he began, shaking his head. "A major blow to our cultural programme. We had a German tourist group scheduled for next month. The security case, Councillor. You were satisfied with it?"
"Satisfied? It's top of the line."
The Aegis 5000, toughened, laminated anti-glare glass, reinforced steel frame. The lock is virtually unpickable.
"I have the brochure in my office."
"It's guaranteed." Finch's tone suggested that the guarantee itself should have been enough to ward off any potential thief. "And yet," Pubright said quietly. "And yet," Finch conceded, his brief wave of confidence crashing against the shore of reality. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Inspector, I don't wish to speak ill of anyone, but Miss Hargreave, she is a woman of a certain
vintage, set in her ways."
That enormous key she carries about. It's a relic. Is it entirely impossible she might have been careless?
"Left the door not quite bolted."
Or perhaps misplaced the key to the case and is simply too proud to admit it. "She seems quite certain," Pubright observed. "She is always certain." Finch's frustration bubbled to the surface. "That's the difficulty. She is certain the 18th century was the pinnacle of human achievement, and everything since has been a steady decline. She fought me tooth and nail over installing the Aegis, called it a vulgar vitrine, wanted to keep the angel in a stone niche with a rusty iron gate.
Can you imagine?
In this day and age?" He sat back, having made his point. In his mind, the matter was clear. The theft was not a failure of his modern, brochure-approved system, but a consequence of the archaic, unpredictable human element embodied by Miss Hargreave. Pubright let the silence hang in the air for a moment. "So, to be clear, Councillor, the transept was secured by an ancient, unique, and supposedly infallible key, and the angel itself was secured by a modern, top-of-the-line, and supposedly infallible lock, both of which were in the sole possession of Miss Hargreave." "Precisely," said Finch, looking relieved that the inspector had grasped the situation so neatly. "Then we have a problem," Pubright said, his expression unchanged. "Because one of them, it appears, was very fallible indeed. He and Sergeant Love walked back into the transept. Nothing had changed. The peacock feather still lay on its velvet bed, a splash of opulent mockery. They were faced with two conflicting articles of faith. The old key and the new lock. One of them had been defeated. But the curious thing, Pubright reflected, was that both Miss Hargreave and Councillor Finch seemed far more interested in proving the fallibility of the other than in finding the person who had so effortlessly proven the fallibility of both. By late afternoon, the official narrative had begun to crystallize, shaped less by evidence and more by the urgent need for a conclusion that would not embarrass anyone important. The chief constable, having received a rather pointed telephone call from a constituent who also happened to be the chairman of the local golf club and a close friend of Councillor Finch, arrived at the station with a brisk, solution-oriented energy. "Right. Pubright," he said, forgoing the usual pleasantries. "This Abbey business.
Finch is in a flap."
We need to show we're on top of it."
"Any low-hanging fruit?"
Inspector Pubright understood the question perfectly. It was not a request for his considered opinion, but for a list of the town's usual inconveniences. "There is always Freddie Trimble, sir," he offered, his tone impeccably neutral. "Freddie Trimble," the chief constable repeated, a flicker of relief in his eyes.
"Of course."
"Fingers Freddie. Hasn't he got form for this sort of thing?" "Not precisely this sort of thing, sir," Pubright clarified gently. His last conviction involved 3 garden gnomes and a set of stolen hubcaps. Ecclesiastical art is a new departure for him. Details, details.
"He's a thief, isn't he?"
"A known thief is at large, and a valuable item has been stolen. It's a logical connection. Find him. Finding Freddie Trimble was rarely a challenge. He was located an hour later in the public bar of the Swan, attempting to sell a suspiciously well-stocked bag of assorted nuts and bolts. At the station, he sat opposite Sergeant Love, radiating an air of weary indignation. He was a small, wiry man with the perpetually startled eyes of someone who expects life to be a series of minor but unpleasant surprises. "The Abbey?"
Me? Freddie scoffed. I'm not a religious man. Never have been.
"The architecture does nothing for me. Where were you last night, Freddie?" Love asked, his pencil poised. "At home. Where else would I be?"
Had my tea, watched a program about barn owls. Riveting stuff.
"Then I went to bed. Anyone see you?" "Only the missus, and she's visiting her sister in Grimsby, isn't she?" he said, a little too quickly. "You can ask her when she's back." Next week it was, as alibis went, functionally useless. A search of his small terraced house revealed nothing, no gilded angel, no peacock feathers, but it did turn up a set of lock picks hidden in a biscuit tin. They were crude, homemade things, better suited to jimmying a bicycle shed than tackling the Aegis 5000, but they were enough. For the chief constable, it was a closed circuit of logic. Freddie was a thief, he had a weak alibi, and he possessed the tools of his trade. It was a neat and tidy parcel, ready to be presented to a concerned public. Sergeant Love, a man who appreciated neatness, was inclined to agree. "It fits, sir," he said to Pubright later, as they stood once more in the silent transept. The Socko team had finished, leaving behind a fine dusting of fingerprint powder on the glass case. Freddie gets wind of this valuable new exhibit. He nips in, uses his picks on that fancy new lock. Maybe it wasn't as tough as the brochure claimed, and he's away with the angel before anyone's the wiser. "It's certainly a version of events," Pubright conceded. He walked slowly around the display case. "But it leaves one or two small questions unanswered. Sir, if you were Freddie, Sergeant, a man in a hurry, why would you spend time meticulously picking a lock when a single, well-aimed brick would achieve the same result in a fraction of the second?"
Maybe he didn't want to make a noise, Love offered. Perhaps.
"And having successfully stolen the angel, why would you then reach into your pocket, pull out a peacock feather that you had brought along for just such an occasion,
And place it carefully in the center of the case?"
Freddie Trimble doesn't strike me as a man with a flair for the dramatic." Pubright paused, his gaze fixed on the empty velvet. "He is an opportunist. He steals what is easy and what is useful. This crime was neither. It was difficult, precise, and articulate. It was designed to say something. I doubt very much that Freddie has anything to say, other than to complain about the price of beer." Sergeant Love considered this. It was true the feather was an odd touch for a man like Freddie, but a bird in the hand, even a questionable one, was better than no suspects at all. "Still, sir, he's our best bet." "He's our only bet at present," Pubright corrected him softly, which is not quite the same thing. He turned and walked away, leaving Sergeant Love to contemplate the official, satisfactory solution that somehow failed to account for a single, shimmering, and entirely illogical feather. While the official police machinery was grinding slowly and satisfyingly towards charging Freddie Trimble, Inspector Pubright found himself drawn back to the Abbey the following morning. The chief constable was happy, Councillor Finch was provisionally relieved, and Sergeant Love was busy building a case based on circumstantial evidence and a general lack of imagination. Pubright, therefore, felt at liberty to pursue the one detail that still troubled him, the sheer, pointless elegance of the crime. He found Beatrice Plummet on her knees in the chancel, applying beeswax to the brass eagle of the lectern with a grim, circular motion. She worked with the proprietorial air of one who was on intimate terms with every stone and splinter of the building. "Mrs. Plummet," Pubright began, his voice barely disturbing the dusty silence. "May I have another moment?" She looked up, her expression a mixture of weary duty and the self-importance of a key witness. "If it's about that Freddie Trimble, I could have told you.
He's a wrong 'un.
Pinched a bag of my best compost last spring." "It's not about Mr. Trimble," Pubright said. It's about what you saw yesterday morning. When you first came in." Beatrice straightened up, rubbing her lower back.
"I saw what I told you."
Miss Hargreaves standing there like she'd been turned to stone, the little gold man gone, and that feather a sign, Inspector.
"A warning. You mentioned a chill," Pubright prompted gently, indulging the narrative.
"The ghost of the grey monk." That's right. She warmed to her theme, her polishing rag momentarily forgotten. A definite cold spot. You get them in a place this old.
"Pockets of sadness," the vicar calls them, and a feeling. Like the air was all stirred up, disturbed, and there was a smell. A smell?
This was new, faint-like.
Not nasty, sort of
"Spiritual," she said, searching for the right word.
Like you get at Christmas.
"A bit sweet. Fruity." Pubright remained patient, his face a mask of polite interest. He let her follow her own train of thought, knowing that to push was to risk derailment. My Arthur, God rest him, he was partial to a drop of sherry before the Queen's speech.
Said it was the only way to get through it.
It was a bit like that.
A whiff of sherry. I thought maybe the vicar had been using a new kind of polish, but it wasn't polish. She stopped, her eyes focusing on the memory.
"And another thing."
"It's probably nothing." "I'm always interested in nothings, Mrs. Plummet." "Well, when I looked in that glass box before you all came trampling through, I noticed the velvet, right in the corner where the angel's feet would have been."
It looked a bit darker than the rest. Damp? Just a patch.
"No bigger than a penny."
I nearly touched it, but Miss Hargreave was giving me one of her looks, so I kept my hands to myself. But it looked damp, and that's where the smell was coming from. Sherry and damp velvet.
"Funny, isn't it?"
"Yes," Pubright said, the single word carrying a weight of consideration that was lost on his companion. "Very funny indeed." He thanked her for her time and left her to her eternal battle with the tarnishing brass. As he walked out of the Abbey and into the thin morning sunshine, he considered this new piece of information. The case against Freddie Trimble, already flimsy, now seemed positively transparent. Freddie was a man of cheap beer and desperation. He was not a man of sweet sherry. Spilling a drink during a delicate, silent burglary suggested a certain class of individual, a person of nerves perhaps who required a little fortification. It spoke of an amateur, but an amateur of a particular sort. A brick through the glass was the work of a common thief, but a picked lock, a theatrical feather, and the faint, aristocratic scent of amontillado on a patch of damp velvet, that was the work of someone else entirely. The neat, tidy parcel presented by the chief constable was beginning to come undone. The name of Mr. Silas Croft, antiquarian, was known to Inspector Pubright in the way that the name of a notoriously difficult opera singer might be known to a theatre manager. Mr. Croft was a source of occasional, highly specialized trouble, usually in the form of letters to the Flaxborough Chronicle, decrying the council's latest lapse in aesthetic judgment. He was, Pubright knew, a man for whom the entire 20th century had been a profound and personal disappointment. More to the point, he was a man who considered himself the sole arbiter of historical authenticity in a town he viewed as dangerously susceptible to sentiment. A man like that, Pubright reasoned, might have a professional opinion on the Gilded Angel. Croft lived in a tall, narrow Georgian house that seemed to be actively sneering at its more modern neighbours. Pubright was shown into a study so densely packed with books, maps and artefacts that it felt less like a room and more like the inside of a particularly intellectual magpie's nest. Dust, which in any other house would have signified neglect, here seemed to be a deliberate part of the academic patina. Silas Croft emerged from behind a mountain of leather-bound folios. He was a small, dry man, impeccably dressed in tweed that had seen better decades. He peered at Pubright over a pair of half-moon spectacles, his expression one of weary impatience. "Inspector, to what do I owe this intrusion? Has the council decided to pave over the medieval marketplace with plastic grass?" "Nothing would surprise me," "Nothing so drastic, Mr. Croft," Pubright said calmly. "I've come about the unfortunate business at the Abbey." "Ah, yes." A thin, humourless smile touched Croft's lips. "The celestial MacGuffin."
I heard it had flown the coop.
I must confess, my primary emotion was one of relief. Relief?
Of course.
Relief that I shall no longer have to endure the smug pronouncements of Alistair Finch about his priceless treasure, nor the sentimental bleatings of Lucinda Hargreave about its spiritual significance. Croft gestured to a chair that was already occupied by a stack of auction catalogues. Pubright remained standing. Croft drifted over to a small table on which sat a tantalus containing a single, nearly full decanter of amber liquid. He poured a small measure into a crystal glass. "The entire affair is a farce, Inspector. A comedy of provincial ignorance. You didn't believe the angel to be valuable, then?" Croft gave a short, sharp bark of a laugh. "Valuable? My dear man, its only value lay in the depths of its own fraudulence. It's a Victorian fake, a rather clumsy one at that. The drapery is all wrong for the 14th century. The posture owes more to a pre-Raphaelite painting than to Gothic devotional carving, and the gilding, even before the council's recent Midas-like vandalism, was of a type not invented until the 1880s. It is, to put it plainly, a piece of sentimental tat, foisted upon a gullible town by generations of well-meaning but utterly ignorant vicars." He took a sip of his drink, savouring it. Pubright recognised the distinctive nutty aroma he had been thinking about all morning. "Sherry?" "I made my professional opinion known, of course," Croft continued, his voice dripping with disdain. "I wrote a letter to the Preservation Society, to Miss Hargreave herself."
I laid out the evidence.
I was polite, scholarly, irrefutable.
And do you know what her response was?
She said it had the truth of faith, which was more important than the dry truth of facts. Can you credit it? The woman is a menace.
An emotional Luddite. And Councillor Finch?
Pubright inquired. "Finch?" Croft scoffed. "Finch wouldn't know a genuine antique if it bit him on his overstuffed waistcoat. He saw a shiny object that could be leveraged for a paragraph in the Chronicle and a pat on the back from the tourist board. The angel's authenticity was utterly irrelevant to him. In fact, my pointing out it was a fake was a profound inconvenience. He suggested I was unpatriotic." Purbright's gaze drifted around the room, taking in the chaotic collection. A Roman coin sat next to a fossilized ammonite. A dusty gas mask from the Great War served as a bookend, and in the far corner, standing in the shadows, was its silent, glassy-eyed master. It was a taxidermied peacock, its magnificent tail fanned in a permanent state of dusty, iridescent glory. "That's a magnificent bird, Mr. Croft," Pubright remarked quietly. Croft followed his gaze.
"Ah, yes, my watchman. A gift from a grateful client."
Pavoklistatus, a creature of breathtaking beauty and monumental vanity.
It struts and displays its finery to prove its worth without the slightest awareness of how ridiculous it truly is. He turned his sharp, intelligent eyes back to Pubright.
A rather fitting metaphor for the custodians of Flaxborough's heritage, don't you think? "An interesting thought," said Pubright. He had arrived with a question about an artifact. He was leaving with a portrait of a motive. Silas Croft had the expertise to know the angel was a fake, the academic arrogance to despise its veneration, and a clearly articulated contempt for the two people most invested in its fame. He also had a decanter of sherry on his desk and a peacock in his study. As Pubright walked down the steps of the narrow Georgian house, he felt the flimsy case against Freddie Trimble dissolve into utter irrelevance. The theft of the Gilded Angel was not a crime of opportunity. It was, he was now quite certain, a crime of literary criticism. The wheels of justice, particularly in a small town, often require a gentle but persistent push from a man in a uniform. Sergeant Love was providing that push the following morning, methodically assembling the case against Freddie Trimble. He had a suspect with a criminal record, a non-existent alibi, and a set of tools that, with a little imagination, could be elevated to the status of a burglar's kit. It was not a case that would make legal history, but it was, in Love's opinion, a case that would hold up. It was paperwork. It was progress. Inspector Pubright, meanwhile, was engaged in the less tangible work of contemplation. The memory of Silas Croft's study, the arrogant pronouncements, the sherry, the peacock, had arranged itself in his mind into a compelling, if incomplete, mosaic. It was a far more interesting picture than the one Sergeant Love was so diligently framing, but it lacked a key component: proof. The morning's post arrived at 10 o'clock, delivered by a postman who harboured a deep suspicion of all police correspondence. Among the usual brown envelopes from headquarters was a small, square parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with cheap string. It was addressed in neat block capitals to the Inspector, Flaxborough Constabulary. The postmark was local from the previous evening. Probably another complaint from that chap on North Street about his neighbour's cat, Love commented. Without looking up from his typewriter, Pubright picked it up. It was light, almost weightless. He carefully undid the string and unfolded the paper. Inside, nestled in a bed of crumpled paper, lay a single, gilded wing. Sergeant Love stopped typing. The quiet clatter of the keys was replaced by an even quieter silence. He got up and came to stand by the inspector's desk. There was no doubt as to its origin. The particular shade of over-enthusiastic gold was unmistakable.
It was the left wing of the Gilded Angel of St. Odo. It had been snapped off at the shoulder with a clean break. "Well," Love said,
stating the obvious with a sense of profound relief. "That proves Freddie didn't just melt it down. It proves a great many things."
"Sergeant," Pubright murmured, his attention focused not on the wing itself,
but on the paper that had been used as padding. He carefully picked it out of the box and smoothed it flat on his desk. "It proves our thief is not interested in profit. It proves he is a local resident. And it proves he wishes to communicate." The paper was a page torn from a newsletter. A quick glance at the top confirmed its source: St. Michael's Parish Chronicle, tidings and forthcoming events. It was a simple, typed sheet, full of announcements for the jumble sale and a request for more volunteers for the flower rota. Purbright's eyes scanned the columns, and then he found it. Under the heading, "This coming Sunday's service," the order of worship was listed. The final item was the sermon. A circle had been drawn around it, not with a pen, but with a thick, waxy red pencil, the kind used for marking schoolchildren's homework. The title of the sermon, delivered by the Reverend Alistair Dobson, was "On the Worship of False Idols." Sergeant Love read it over Purbright's shoulder.
"False idols," he breathed.
"That's what Silas Croft said it was."
"A fake. This has to be him, sir."
"He's mocking everyone." "It is certainly a compelling interpretation," Pubright agreed. He picked up the gilded wing. It was surprisingly light, the wood old and dry beneath the new gold leaf. Mr. Croft sees the angel as a historical falsehood, an object of misplaced veneration for the historically illiterate. This, however, he gestured with the wing towards the circled text, suggests something more.
A theological objection.
A moral one. The crime had just acquired a new and far more complicated layer of meaning. It had begun as a simple theft, then evolved into an act of academic critique. Now it had taken on the unmistakable tint of religious fervour. A thief who steals to sell is a simple proposition. A thief who steals to make a point about artistic provenance is a more complex one. But a thief who steals to make a point about the salvation of a town's collective soul was another matter entirely. "The Reverend Dobson," Pubright said quietly, more to himself than to Love. "I don't believe I've had the pleasure." He placed the wing down carefully next to the parish newsletter. The two clues lay side by side on his desk, a piece of a gilded angel and a message about false gods. The neat, tidy case against Freddie Trimble had not just been complicated, it had been rendered entirely obsolete, and in his place a new and far more intriguing set of possibilities had emerged, smelling faintly of old books, sherry, and now communion wine. Sergeant Love, with the weary sigh of a man whose neatly constructed house of cards has been blown over by a sudden, inconvenient gust of wind, had gone to release Freddie Trimble. The paperwork, he muttered, would be a nightmare. Pubright was left alone in the quiet of his office. On the blotter before him lay the gilded wing and the page from the parish newsletter, a fragment of a supposed treasure and a fragment of a moral argument. He leaned back in his chair, the springs groaning in protest. The case, which for a brief, officially sanctioned moment had been straightforward, had now become almost entirely abstract. The motive, he was certain, was not greed. A greedy man would not mail back his spoils piece by piece. Greed was a simple, linear equation that resulted in cash. This was something far more convoluted. Was it spite, perhaps? There was certainly no shortage of it in the dry, academic contempt of Silas Croft. His disdain for Miss Hargreaves' sentimentality and Councillor Finch's ambition was palpable. To steal the angel merely to prove them wrong, to humiliate them in the court of public opinion, that felt psychologically plausible. It was the ultimate, irrefutable letter to the editor, a crime born of intellectual pride. Or was it, as the circled sermon suggested, a warped sense of justice? A moral crusade in miniature. The Reverend Dobson, or an overzealous member of his flock, deciding that the town's growing affection for this shiny trinket was bordering on the idolatrous, a misguided attempt to redirect Flaxborough's spiritual compass away from a gilded falsehood and back towards a more austere, invisible truth. A crime as a theological statement. Pubright picked up a pencil and rolled it between his fingers. Pride, spite, justice. They were all powerful motivators, far more powerful in a town like this than mere financial gain. Money was a private matter, but reputation was public property. And as he considered the key players, he realized that the little wooden angel, fake or not, had become the focal point for the entire town's delicate economy of status. Councillor Finch had built a platform on it. It was his project, his gift to the town, a tangible symbol of his modernizing, progressive influence. Its theft was a direct challenge to his competence and his public standing. Miss Hargreaves' reputation was staked on the opposite. She was the guardian of tradition, the defender of the town's authentic soul. The angel to her was a sacred trust, and its loss under the new, council-approved security was a vindication of her old-fashioned principles and a personal affront to her stewardship. And Silas Croft, his entire identity was predicated on being the only man in town who knew the difference between truth and fiction. The veneration of a fake was an insult to his expertise, a public celebration of the very ignorance he fought against. For the angel to be lauded was for him to be ignored. Each of them had more invested in that small carving than its negligible market value. They had invested their reputations. And in Flaxborough, a man's reputation was the house he lived in, the chair he sat on at council meetings, the deference in the shopkeeper's voice. It was everything. The crime, Pubright concluded, had very little to do with the gilded angel itself. The angel was simply the stage on which a very personal drama was being played out. The thief had not stolen an object. They had stolen a symbol. They had kicked over the cornerstone of several carefully constructed public lives. The method was not that of a common burglar, but of a social critic with a flair for theatricality. The peacock feather, the returned wing, the circled sermon, they were all footnotes to the main text of the crime, designed to be read and interpreted. This was not a case that would be solved by fingerprints or forensics, but by understanding the precise, terrible weight of a small-town reputation. To solve a crime of communication, Inspector Pubright reasoned, one had to open a new channel of correspondence. His own communication took the form of 4 polite handwritten notes, inviting the principal figures in the Angel affair to an informal consultation at the Abbey. The stated purpose was to discuss potential upgrades to the security, a subject broad enough to command the attendance of all parties. They gathered the next afternoon in the north transept, a small, awkward constellation of competing interests orbiting the empty display case. Councillor Finch arrived first, radiating a sense of managerial urgency. He was followed by Miss Hargreave, who looked as though she were attending a parole hearing for a building she was fond of. The Reverend Alistair Dobson, a gentle, stooping man with a perpetually worried expression, came next, having been summoned from the vicarage. He seemed to be the only one present who was not armed with a pre-existing grievance. Finally, Silas Croft appeared, his presence a small, sharp point of intellectual hostility in the pious gloom. He had come, his expression seemed to say, only to witness the full spectrum of human folly at close range. "Thank you all for coming," Pubright began, his voice calm and conversational. "As you know, the investigation is proceeding. But, in the meantime, Councillor Finch is rightly concerned that we review the Abbey's security arrangements to prevent any future
incidents." Finch nodded gravely.
"Precisely. We can't have this happening again. I'm prepared to recommend the Council approve a significant budget for a fully integrated system."
"Alarms, sensors, the works? More wires and boxes?"
Miss Hargreave said, her voice thin with disapproval. "This is a house of God, Councillor, not a bank vault. The Angel was perfectly safe for 600 years without the need for electronic sensors." "And was stolen the first night it was placed under your care," Croft interjected, his voice dry as dust. "Perhaps the medieval approach has its limitations." Before Miss Hargreave could retort, the Reverend Dobson held up a placating hand.
"Please, we're all distressed."
"Let us hear what the inspector has to say." All eyes turned to Pubright. He walked over to the empty case. "Investigation has taken a new turn. We have, as you know, recovered a piece of the Angel." He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. "I have been in contact with an expert at the British Museum, a specialist in medieval woodwork." This got their full attention. Finch looked impressed. Miss Hargreave leaned forward, a flicker of hope in her eyes. Pubright continued, his tone matter-of-fact. "He was most interested to hear of the recovery. He tells me that the study of woodworm patterns has become a remarkably precise science. Apparently, the species of wood-boring beetle common in this part of England during the 14th century left a very distinctive pattern of channels in oak. Sort of signature, you might say. Entirely unique. He is coming down tomorrow to analyze the wing. He seems quite confident that he will be able to confirm the wood's 14th century origin almost immediately." He finished his statement and then simply watched them. His gaze moving slowly from one face to the next. Councillor Finch beamed. "Inspector, that's marvellous news. A definitive authentication from the British Museum. It will silence the doubters once and for all."
A huge boon for the town. His concern was, as ever, for the public narrative. Miss Hargreave clasped her hands together. "Oh, thank goodness," she breathed, her voice thick with emotion. "To have it proven."
"To know for certain what I have always felt in my heart." Her faith was about to be rewarded with facts. The Reverend Dobson nodded thoughtfully. "How wonderful is the world that God has made," he murmured. "That even the lowly woodworm can leave a testimony that lasts for centuries." His was a simple appreciation of a newly discovered wonder. Purbright's gaze finally settled on Silas Croft. The antiquarian's face, usually a mask of cynical amusement, had gone rigid. A small muscle twitched in his jaw. When he spoke, his voice was a fraction sharper than usual, the careful academic detachment replaced by a brittle tension. "That is, if you'll forgive me, Inspector, utter nonsense," he snapped. "Entomological forensics on woodwork of that age? It's a pseudoscience."
"Vague at best."
"Any competent scholar would tell you that dendrochronology is the only accepted method. and even that is often inconclusive. This expert of yours sounds like a charlatan." "He came very highly recommended," Pubright said mildly. "I'm sure he did," Croft retorted, his eyes glinting with something that looked remarkably like panic. "But I assure you his findings will be scientifically worthless. A complete waste of time and taxpayers' money." He had taken the bait. Pubright had invented his woodworm expert out of thin air, creating a test that only one person in the room could possibly fail. Finch, Hargreave, and Dobson had no reason to doubt the science. They accepted it as another fact in a world full of strange facts. But Silas Croft, the man who knew for an absolute certainty that the Gilded Angel was a Victorian fake, also knew that no expert could possibly find 14th century woodworm patterns in it. The test was not designed to identify the wood. It was designed to identify the man who knew, with a sinking, sickening dread, what the wood was not. Inspector Pubright sat opposite the Chief Constable's imposing desk. Sergeant Love was seated to his right, a fresh notebook open on his knee, his pen held at the ready. The Gilded Wing and the parish newsletter lay in the centre of the desk, two small, strange islands on a sea of polished mahogany. The Chief Constable, a man who preferred his crimes to come with a signed confession and a list of stolen goods, looked at the exhibits with profound distaste. "So, Pubright," he said, clearing his throat, "you've released Trimble. Love tells me you have a new theory, one that doesn't involve our usual clientele." "The facts have pointed in a new direction, sir," Pubright began, his voice even and unhurried. "The case against Freddie Trimble was always
unsatisfactory.
It accounted for the theft of an object, but it failed to account for the crime itself. The lack of forced entry, for one.
And the peacock feather.
It was a piece of theatre, and Freddie Trimble is not a theatrical man. The crime was articulate, and our thief, it turns out, is a man of many words." He paused, letting the statement settle. "The first indication that we were looking for the wrong sort of person came from Beatrice Plummet, the Abbey caretaker. She noticed a patch of damp velvet in the display case and a faint smell. She described it as sweet like sherry. Now, a common thief surprised during a burglary might spill something, but it is unlikely to be amontillado. That detail suggested an amateur, but an amateur of a certain social standing. Someone who might carry a flask for fortification against the nerves of a first foray into crime." The Chief Constable grunted.
A non-committal sound. "Then there was the feather," Pubright continued.
A flamboyant, almost literary gesture. It bespoke vanity, display, a desire to be noticed. On its own, it was merely an oddity. But when I paid a visit to Mr. Silas Croft, the antiquarian, I found he kept a rather magnificent taxidermied peacock in his study. He spoke of it as a symbol of vanity and foolishness, a metaphor, he suggested, for the town's leadership. The coincidence was noted. Coincidence isn't evidence, Pubright. No, sir. But it can be a useful signpost, and it pointed directly towards the question of motive. Mr. Croft has a long-standing and very public conviction that the Gilded Angel is a worthless Victorian forgery. He has been ignored by Councillor Finch and dismissed by Miss Hargreave. His professional pride was wounded. What better way to prove his point, to humiliate his detractors and establish his own intellectual supremacy, than to steal the object of their veneration and demonstrate how little they really knew? Pubright leaned forward slightly. The theft was an act of criticism. He likely used a set of fine specialist picks on the old, simple lock of the transept door, a lock he would have had ample opportunity to study over the years. His contempt was always for the new council-approved lock on the case, a classic piece of misdirection. Inside in the dark, his hand likely shook as he fumbled with the angel, spilling a few drops of sherry from his flask onto the velvet, a moment of pure, unprofessional clumsiness. He then placed the feather, a piece of his own stuffed peacock, I imagine, as his calling card.
A signature, Sergeant Love was writing furiously, the pieces clicking into place, but his ego wouldn't let him leave it there, Pubright went on.
He had to continue the lecture, so he broke off a wing and mailed it to us. It was a gesture of contempt for the object's material value, but it was the wrapping that was his masterstroke. A page from the parish newsletter with the Reverend's sermon on false idols circled in red. It was perfect. He was co-opting the vicar's moral argument to support his own academic one. The angel was a fake, a false artifact, and therefore a false idol. It was a clever, layered, and deeply arrogant message. The chief constable stared at the gilded wing. The theory was elaborate, but it had a certain, undeniable coherence. It's a fine story, Pubright, but it's still just a theory. You have no proof. That is what the meeting at the Abbey was for, sir, Pubright said calmly. I needed to test the theory.
I needed a piece of information that would be meaningless to an innocent person,
but which would strike at the very heart of the guilty party's knowledge. He described the scene in the transept, the gathering of the suspects. I invented an expert from the British Museum, and I invented a science for him to practice, the identification of 14th century woodworm patterns. For Councillor Finch, it was a welcome development. For Miss Hargreave, it was the hope of vindication. For the Reverend, a source of mild wonder. To the three of them, it was just another fact. They had no reason to disbelieve it. Purbright's voice became very quiet. But for the man who stole the angel because he knew, with absolute unshakable certainty, that it was carved from Victorian-era wood, it was a catastrophe. A real expert, armed with a real microscope, would not find 14th century woodworm. He would find evidence of 19th century timber. My fictitious expert was about to prove his central thesis for him, but in the process, he would also prove Croft's guilt. His reaction was instantaneous. Not relief, not curiosity, but panic. He immediately attacked the premise. He called the science nonsense a charlatan's trick. He was the only person in that room who had a vested interest in my expert being wrong. It was the only possible reaction for a man who knew the wood was a lie. He wasn't just arguing a point of academic principle. He was trying to discredit the very evidence that would convict him. His panicked dismissal, sir, was a confession. There was a long silence in the room. Pubright sat back. The unravelling was complete. All the strange, disconnected parts, the sherry, the feather, the sermon, the science, were now woven into a single, logical thread. The interview with Silas Croft was less of an interrogation and more of a university seminar for which he was the sole enthusiastic speaker. Faced with the elegant and inescapable logic of the woodworm gambit, he did not so much confess as hold forth. He seemed genuinely pleased to have his methods and motivations understood by an appreciative audience. A confession implies regret. "Inspector," he said, sitting in Purbright's office and carefully steepling his fingers, "I have no regret.
I have been vindicated.
I was forced to take direct, practical action to correct a flaw in the public's understanding of its own history. You might call it a crime. I consider it an unscheduled lecture with a practical demonstration." He was, Pubright noted, far more concerned with confirming the details of the angel's historical inaccuracies than with the prospect of a criminal charge. The gilded angel itself was recovered from a shelf in his study, propped between a book on medieval iconography and another on detecting Victorian fakes. It looked small and rather pathetic, a piece of evidence that had caused far more trouble than it was worth. The matter of a prosecution was debated in the chief constable's office, with a very pale Councillor Finch in attendance. A public trial, it was quickly agreed, would be an unmitigated disaster. It would expose the town's most treasured relic as a fraud, make a laughingstock of the council's investment, and give Silas Croft a public platform from which to air his grievances and theories to a far wider audience. It was an outcome that served no one. Reputation, which had been the motive for the crime, was now the primary reason for its erasure, and so a quiet, face-saving solution was engineered. Mr. Croft would issue a private and entirely insincere apology to the Preservation Society. The Gilded Angel would be returned to the Abbey, its brief sojourn in Mr. Croft's study officially designated as an unauthorized academic loan. The police report, which Sergeant Love typed up with a weary sense of the absurd, would conclude that the affair was, at its heart, a profound misunderstanding between parties. Freddie Trimble received a small compensation from the Police Benevolent Fund for his wrongful detention, a sum he promptly drank away at the Swan. Life in Flaxborough resumed its normal placid rhythm. The Gilded Angel, its wing now discreetly repaired, was returned to its glass case in the north transept, though this time there was no photographer and no grand speeches from Councillor Finch. It was still an object of interest for visitors, but a subtle change had occurred. It was now viewed with a certain knowing irony, its authenticity a subject of quiet local debate rather than unquestioning faith. Miss Hargreave continued her duties with grim determination, though her certainty had been replaced by a defensive piety. Back in his office, Inspector Pubright finished the last page of his final report. He assembled the various statements and documents into a neat pile, clipped them together, and wrote "Closed" in the top corner of the cover sheet in his tidy, precise hand. The case of the Gilded Angel, with all its tangled threads of pride, spite, and intellectual vanity, was now reduced to a slim file. It was a small, contained narrative of human folly, its passions and pretensions neatly filed away. He stood up, walked over to the tall metal filing cabinet, and slid the file into its designated slot between a case of petty vandalism and a dispute over a garden fence. The drawer slid shut with a quiet, definitive click, restoring the last ripple on the calm surface of the town's daily life.